With a successful career and a loving son, only one thing was missing.
She wanted to have a father for her son. She wanted to have a husband for her.
But just when she saw happiness on the horizon, her life is cut short.
There's been a shooting at a donut shop drive-thru.
Her eyes were still open, but she was not responsive.
And while leads seemed to be everywhere,
This was a very commercial area, so there's cameras all over.
The witnesses are shocked by what they saw.
following the trail turns out to be a difficult trek to the truth.
The suspect's car matches the description of a vehicle from another crime.
Both crimes involved 9mm handguns.
It was the mindset of who would want to do this and why.
It's a tale of love, heartbreak, and revenge.
They realized that something bigger is going on here.
You could tell that something clearly was not on the up and up.
It goes from a flirtatious relationship to one that's sexual in nature, a full-blown affair.
April 11th, 2023. It's the Tuesday after Easter in Cheltenham Township, Pennsylvania, a small suburban town just outside of central Philadelphia.
This is one of the more promising nearby suburbs. A lot of college-educated folks and people who, looking for a new opportunity.
It's always had a lot of industry, a lot of jobs. It's always busy.
So when a flood of 911 calls ring in around 7:30 that morning, it sends an alarm unlike any they've known before.
Several people are reporting that they heard gunshots at a donut shop drive-thru on the edge of town.
Without a moment to spare, officers rush to the scene.
Officers find an SUV still running and backed onto the curb.
Inside, they find a woman slumped over in the front seat.
Her eyes were still open, but she was not responsive.
Go ahead and start me EMTs.
But behind her is a young 11-year-old boy.
The woman in the driver's seat is his mother, Rachel King.
"35-year-old Rachel King had an impeccable glow about her, with an unmatched love for others.
Everything Rachel did was big. Her hair was big, her style was big, her laugh was big.
I think that loudness really just came from, the love overflowing.
She's going to bring love and energy to any space she goes to.
Growing up in a large family, it's no wonder Rachel had love in abundance.
There were 7 of us, so my parents, and then there's 5 kids.
Though I was the youngest, it was my role to be her bodyguard, make sure she's protected.
At the head of their strong family unit was their father, a beloved reverend in the community.
For him, the church is more than the 4 walls. He worked at a juvenile detention center. He's been a dean of students, and he's always kind of supporting students out of the classroom as well.
Before long, Rachel found herself following in her father's footsteps.
She was passionate about her faith. She was passionate about education.
She wanted to be a teacher since she was in high school. She knew that.
When she went to Eastern University for college, she really fell in love with elementary education and social studies.
She also fell in love with a charming man she'd met through mutual friends.
He did not go to Eastern, but was friends with several of the young men who did. And they met maybe Rachel's junior year.
He's your stereotypical good-looking guy, everything that a woman's looking for.
Before long, the couple welcomed a baby boy into their lives.
He came into the world very loved.
No matter if there were going to be more kids or not, he was always going to be her baby boy.
With her son by her side, Rachel remained diligent, and after graduating, landed a dream job at a charter school in Philadelphia.
Her school saw how much Rachel loves education and loved kids.
She was just so enwrapped with everything with the school. Just being able to not only be a teacher, but to be a confidant for a lot of her students.
However, while her career was thriving, her relationship was falling apart.
The person Rachel thought that he wasn't.
And eventually, they broke things off.
But in the fall of 2020, Rachel got a second chance at love.
Rachel met Aaron. He was a single father, and they lived in the same apartment complex, and they both worked in the childhood education field.
There were a couple of years that my mom lived with Rachel and his daughter went to the same school and rode the same bus as my nephew.
Rachel's mom helped by watching the kids go off to school while they went to work.
Aaron ended up asking Rachel to go out on a date.
With their similar backgrounds, Rachel felt drawn to Aaron.
It was very easy to hit it off with someone who cares about family and cares about children and their well-being and education and knows what that takes.
He also supported Rachel's growth as an educator, pushing her to succeed.
Rachel's eyes were bigger than just teaching at that point. She just wanted to go into the space of being more administrative.
That summer, she was going to go back to school to work towards her principal certification.
The couple was looking forward to the future, but not just professionally.
Late 2021, it was maybe early 2022, he was talking about marrying Rachel.
Their blended family was coming together, and things were looking up.
But now, Rachel has been found shot in her car at the drive-thru of a donut shop. And her son in the back seat has seen everything.
The driver's window was shattered, and you could clearly see that the female behind the wheel was injured.
He's begging them to help his mom, and all while holding a phone. And when police ask, he says he called his aunt.
In fact, his Aunt Ayana has heard everything since shortly before officers arrived.
He says mommy's been shot.
EMTs do everything they can to revive Rachel. But unfortunately, there's nothing they can do.
You could hear my nephew screaming, "Why aren't they doing anything? Why aren't they helping mommy?"
Sadly, Rachel dies right there at the scene.
At 35 years old, Rachel King was a successful teacher and single mother who had found the one she hoped to marry in a charming man named Aaron.
They were both very serious about moving towards marriage. And that summer, she was going to go back to school to work towards her principal certification.
But now, police have found Rachel dead in the front seat of her SUV, with her traumatized son sitting in the back.
He's asking why they're not doing anything, but his aunt, who's listening on the phone, understands what's happened.
I didn't say this to him, right, because he's a child. But, right, I'm just because there's nothing to be done. She's gone.
Officers tell his aunt that she can meet up with her nephew at the police station.
After Rachel's son is escorted off the scene, homicide detectives arrive and begin their investigation.
They found the vehicle came to a stop at the curb.
Inside, detectives find Rachel King still in the driver's seat.
They see that Rachel has been shot 5 times, and it looks like she died instantly.
Nothing was taken from the vehicle.
This wasn't a robbery gone wrong.
Outside of the vehicle, detectives discover another crucial clue.
They located 6 shell casings that was ejected from the shooter's 9mm handgun.
To get more information about what actually went down, detectives start asking around.
When the detectives interviewed the witnesses, they all were pretty much in line with the same story.
They saw a black male in a hoodie standing at the driver's side of Rachel's SUV, pointing a gun.
Then he gets in a car and takes off.
Unfortunately, tracking the driver or getaway vehicle will be more difficult than they'd hoped.
They received information from witnesses that it was a light-colored sedan, but none of the witnesses were able to see the license plate of the vehicle.
Witnesses also didn't have a really clear description on what his face looked like.
But this was a very commercial area, so there's cameras all over the area.
So detectives collect security footage.
As they review the video, it matches the witness statements to a T.
And it ends up showing the sedan pulling the parking lot. He gets out, draws a weapon, and fires at Rachel multiple times before he flees the scene.
But a few key details are missing.
They did try to conceal his identity by having on a hood and had it zipped up.
Unfortunately, the video doesn't get clear footage of the car's license plate.
Still, it confirms this was no random attack.
This is a person that made it a point to go directly after Rachel. This was an assassination.
With leads from the scene exhausted, detectives head to the Child Advocacy Center to observe an interview with Rachel's son.
He is their big primary witness. Of course, this is inexplicable trauma. To lose your parent at such a young age and witness it as a murder.
Thankfully, that's where the Child Advocacy Center comes in to help.
They're trained to get the child to relax and trust you in order to open up.
I just remember when they offered him to pick any one of all of these bears. And because of work that I used to do, I know what they symbolize. They're grief bears.
Once he's settled in, Rachel's son tells the social worker what he remembers.
He tells her that his mom was taking him to violin lessons before they went to school.
He started to get a treat.
Then he saw a man outside her window with a gun.
He said the first bullet missed, but the others hit.
Immediately, Rachel's son dove down to hide in the back seat.
He didn't come out until after the shooting stopped, and when he did, the man was gone.
But my mom, she wasn't talking. She wasn't moving.
So my nephew called 911. And I just remember him telling me, I couldn't get words out. I couldn't get words out.
I can't even imagine the type of fear he was experiencing.
However, when asked if he could identify the shooter, Rachel's son says no.
He could not give them a name.
With still no possible ID for the shooter, detectives will have to rely on another plan of action.
Once they have a still shot of the vehicle, it's given to the media to display.
Media outlets online began to really share this. Everyone's talking about it.
But when a call finally comes in about the car, detectives are surprised by the caller ID.
They get a call from police in nearby Philadelphia.
The suspect's car matches the description of another vehicle from a crime that was committed in Philadelphia.
And not only that, it's another homicide.
After releasing the photo of the vehicle used in the killing of Rachel King, detectives have just gotten a call from Philadelphia police saying they've seen a similar vehicle in the city. And it's connected to another murder.
4 days before Rachel's murder, someone shot 35-year-old James Farrell in North Philadelphia, leaving his body in the street.
At first, it seemed like a random attack, but then they noticed details of the crime matched up with Rachel's case.
From some of the surveillance cameras, they see that both crimes were involved with the same vehicle description.
And that's not all.
For James Farrell's murder, it was 11 9mm shell casings that was found at the scene of the crime. There were also 6 9mm shell casings found during Rachel's shooting.
Now detectives have to wonder, were these bullets fired by the same shooter?
And if that's the case, what ties these two shootings together?
At this point, the questions become, who's the driver? Who does this car belong to?
While Philadelphia PD keeps searching, Montgomery County homicide detectives speak to Rachel's grieving family.
Sorry for your loss.
She doesn't have a bad bone in her body. Rachel is such a great person. It was the mindset of why. Who would want to do this and why?
It's that very same question detectives are hoping to get an answer to.
Is there anyone you can think of that wanted to hurt her?
Nobody.
But she is currently in a serious relationship.
She has been dating Aaron for the past couple of years.
They were set to be engaged.
They were in what appeared to be a loving relationship.
What's seen on the outside isn't always a true reflection of a relationship, though. It's really important for investigators to always rule out the victim's significant other, so they'll definitely want to speak to him.
However, nothing so far can answer detectives' biggest question. How does this tie back to James?
So far, there was no obvious connection between Rachel King and James Farrell.
Hoping he can help connect the dots, detectives request to talk to Rachel's boyfriend, Aaron.
They end up talking to him, and he agrees to come in and sit down with detectives.
But while detectives wait for Aaron, Philadelphia police call in with a major update.
They've spotted the same light-colored sedan shown in the security video.
At first, they tried to conduct a regular traffic stop to pull him over and bring the guy in.
But instead of stopping, the driver takes off.
It speeds off, and that leads to a high-speed chase in the city.
I mean, it's giving OJ in the Bronco. He's driving and going, but eventually he hits a fence.
Police end up catching up to him and taking him into custody.
Finally, detectives have an ID on their mystery driver and new prime suspect, 33-year-old Zaki Al-Hakim.
He is immediately brought in for questioning.
Surprisingly, it doesn't take much to get Zaki talking.
So where'd you get the car?
I picked it up at a shop.
He had stated to them that he had purchased a car from an auto body shop 2 weeks prior to him being apprehended.
So were you driving that car on Lindsay Avenue on the 7th?
I stopped at a gas station over on Broad Street.
Okay, so is that you in the photo?
Yeah, that's me.
It's a shocking admission, considering police already have evidence identifying the driver of that car as the man who shot James Farrell.
So were you also driving that same car on Cheltenham Avenue somewhere around 7:30 this morning?
No, I wasn't in that area.
He mentioned that he had been in Kensington hustling drugs.
While the casual confession of drug dealing catches detectives off guard, they don't believe it for a second.
They have some suspicions that he wasn't in Kensington selling drugs on the morning of the 11th.
After the interview, detectives place Zaki under arrest for the murder of James Farrell.
Evidence of Zakeem being at the scene and still shots of the vehicle was enough to hold him for Farrell's murder.
But they're going to need more before charging him in Rachel's murder.
They need more surveillance evidence, a witness, or something to connect him to her.
Detectives decide to start by tracking his story back to the auto shop where he bought the car.
The shop owner said he sold the car to a woman on March 30th, but a man fitting Zaki's description was with her.
She goes there to buy a car at the shop and gives it over to Junkie in this transaction in West Philly.
When the owner tracks down the paperwork in his files, he gives the detective her name, Julie Jean.
But who is Julie Jean?
Before detectives haul her in for questioning, Rachel's boyfriend Aaron arrives for his interview.
He doesn't know the key.
But when they ask him if the name Julie Jean means anything to him, it's an awkward pause.
Then he said, yeah, I do know who Julie is.
Julie was a woman he had been seeing while also dating Rachel.
After catching the suspected shooter in Rachel King's murder, detectives have now learned that the mother's death may be connected to a love triangle involving her boyfriend Aaron and a woman named Julie Jean.
Aaron admitted that he was seeing both Rachel and Julie at the same time.
And just 2 weeks before Rachel's murder, Julie had actually purchased the car, supposedly used in the commission of this crime, then loaned the car to their prime suspect, Junkie al-Hakim.
Back this up, go back. Now tell me how all this got started with Julie.
Aaron said he knew Julie because her kids attended the daycare center where he worked.
She was a young single mother who had a child with disabilities, and Aaron was very helpful in providing resources for that child.
He worked with her to develop her individual education plan, and him and Julie grew close.
So close, in fact, that Julie refused to let anyone else help her daughter.
When he left the program that he was in, she actually took her child out of the program and moved her to the program that Aaron had moved to.
That behavior is definitely a red flag.
However, Aaron found the move endearing. And soon their feelings began to grow for one another.
At the end of 2021, his relationship with Julie goes from flirtatious to one that's sexual in nature.
I was just kind of shocked because he was never that kind of person.
Rachel was persistent on marriage, and she wasn't going to settle for less.
He had some worries about their future together.
So while he and Rachel were working things out, he was secretly seeing Julie on and off.
But soon, Aaron's heart shifted.
Aaron and Rachel, they'd worked through their problems. They'd rekindled their romance.
He wants to get serious with Rachel again.
So he tried to ease out of his relationship with Julie.
But in August, Aaron's at his apartment complex, the same one Rachel lives at. And who does he see? It's Julie.
She ended up telling me that she was going to move in the same building that Rachel and I stayed in.
It should have been a huge red flag, but he admits he hooked up with her a couple of times after that.
However, eventually the arrangement began to weigh on him.
At that point, Aaron saw that it was a possibility of him losing Rachel altogether.
By October, Aaron finally decided to officially cut things off with Julie.
He talked to her and said that he wished the best for her, but he wasn't going to see her anymore.
But Julie could not accept that, no, he doesn't want to be in this relationship with you.
And he says that's when Julie started stalking him.
Julie begins to constantly call him and send him messages.
She got caught looking in his windows and trying to see what was happening in his unit.
She was aggressive in her actions, and he was surprised because he thought she understood.
Soon after the stalking began, things with Julie hit a boiling point.
In early December, he and Rachel had gone to a local mall.
As Aaron and Rachel get into the car, he receives a text message from an unknown number.
It says, "I see you with your girlfriend."
And that spooks Aaron.
Then, hours later, Julie had somehow found Rachel's number.
Julie ends up calling Rachel, and she tells her that her and Aaron had a 10-month affair and that she wanted to be with him.
For Rachel, it was a complete surprise.
Aaron was somebody that she saw a future with, she saw a marriage with, and here comes the side woman.
So she confronts him about it.
Aaron confessed and said, I'm sorry, but I want to be with you.
After some consideration, Rachel eventually accepted Aaron's apology.
Aaron was very present for her son. And so I think that went a lot into her decision to give him a second chance.
However, to move forward, they would need to cut Julie off forever.
Aaron and Rachel had enough and decided to file for a protection order against Julie. After the protection order was granted, Rachel and Julie get into a verbal altercation where Julie tells Rachel, "You should be happy I told you."
And then she threatens Rachel. She's telling Rachel, "Oh, you're gonna get what's yours."
But just as things started to escalate, bailiffs broke up the fight.
In a courtroom where Julie is trying to act like this restraining order is not necessary, she kind of proves the point of why Aaron needs one in the first place.
However, Aaron says he made an impulsive decision by trying to have the two women make amends.
So they met, and Aaron came clean with both of them, and he apologized to Julie.
Julie, I'm really sorry. I didn't intend to lead you on, but my heart's with Rachel.
And Julie even said to him, if I knew you were this involved with someone, I wouldn't have been involved with you the way I was.
Aaron believed that was the end of it, but Julie called him up again.
She wants to have a conversation with him. He decides to do it.
They agreed to meet, but Julie was clearly still upset.
I cannot believe you are seriously cutting me off right now.
Despite Aaron's efforts, Julie doesn't get the message. She doesn't think there's someone better out there.
At that point, she reached over and she tried to unzip his pants, which he pushed away.
After that, Aaron says it seemed like the message was finally received.
She got out of the car, and as she was walking away, she turned and she told him that you're never going to get any of this anymore. And then she walked off.
Detectives have learned that Rachel King's boyfriend Aaron was having an affair with Julie Jean, and it had ended badly. Now, it seems Julie has a strong motive to want Rachel dead.
Julie was a lover scorned. This was a case of a lover's triangle gone wrong.
It's the perfect setting for an act of revenge. But detectives will need to prove it first.
So they asked Julie to come down to the station, and she confirms she knows Aaron.
She also even admits that she knows Aki, that he is the cousin of her baby's father.
Detectives also confirmed Julie had purchased the car Zaki had been driving.
But she quickly offers up to them that she had nothing to do with it.
Though while detectives aren't buying Julie's story, they don't have enough to charge her with a crime.
Before they let her go, they do ask if she would be willing to let them download the contents of her phone. She agrees, and then detectives send that off to be analyzed.
Next, they searched Zaki's phone, which was recovered from his crashed car.
While they don't find any texts between him and Julie, they find something just as suspicious.
Specifically, they find 3 pictures, and the first looks like a map of Rachel's apartment complex, with a pin dropped on Rachel's exact apartment, and a red arrow showing the route to take to get to the residence.
It was saved to his phone's camera roll on February 20th.
5 days later, on February 25th, there's a picture of Rachel herself.
It's a picture of a picture that was taken of another phone. And the picture shows Rachel. And it appears a woman's hand is holding the other phone, displaying the picture of Rachel.
And they believe the woman holding the phone is none other than Julie Jean.
They determined that because when they had Julie's phone, it had a crack in the screen, and it was the same crack that was on the phone that was being held that the picture was taken from.
Then, detectives find an image from March 16th, weeks before the murder, of what they believe is a ghost gun.
Ghost guns are not the formal, you go to a gun store, purchase a gun. This is a manufactured gun.
Together, these paint a damning picture.
The photo of Rachel, the map, the gun, it all spells out contract for a hit.
Which is further confirmed when they receive the subpoenaed phone records for Julie and Zaki.
The cell tower actually placed Julie and Zaki in the same area when the photo was taken of Rachel from the phone.
Zaki's cell phone data places him outside of Rachel's apartment several days leading up to the shooting.
They believe he was figuring out her patterns and her schedule.
To confirm, they pull footage from every camera along Zaki's route that morning of April 11th.
They were able to track him that entire morning.
All of this gave the detectives a basic roadmap to follow how he stalked Rachel and committed this crime.
And when they get the lab report back on Julie's phone, they're shocked by what they find.
For Julie, almost 800 messages were deleted from her phone about 15 minutes before she was called into questioning.
Detectives also locate a unique exchange from less than 5 hours after Rachel's murder.
There was a transaction between Julie and Zaki. It was only for $5. It came from Julie's phone to Zaki's phone, and there was some emojis were in there.
The emojis were a chain, an up arrow, a pager, and a crossed-out phone.
To detectives, it sends a clear message.
It means let's link up and talk. No phones.
Detectives investigating the murder of Rachel King have finally recovered evidence connecting her boyfriend's former lover, 34-year-old Julie Jean, to the suspected shooter, 33-year-old Zaki Al-Hakim.
After getting Julie's phone data back from the lab, they found a payment to Zaki that includes a coded message to meet up less than 5 hours after Rachel was killed.
It's the final piece of the puzzle that, for detectives, proves Julie conspired with Zaki to have Rachel killed.
Now they had everything they needed to file charges. They had images of the vehicle, they had cell phone records, and they were ready to make that case.
Once they knew they had a person of interest, things to me moved quickly. And they were really good at keeping us informed.
And on April 25th, detectives placed Julie Jean under arrest for first-degree murder, third-degree murder, and conspiracy.
Finding out the involvement of everything kind of threw me for a loop. It just showed me that people don't have any kind of sense of self-control.
For Zaki, his charges also include possession of an instrument of crime.
While Julie was let go from authorities the first time she was called in for questioning, that was not the case for Zaki.
Zaki was already in custody for James Farrell's murder, and now he's being charged with Rachel King's murder.
So this man is now in 2 murder cases at the same time.
Immediately following the arrests, the DA holds a press conference with Rachel's family in attendance.
They thank the authorities for their help in solving the case, and specifically, Rachel's family thanks God for his help.
I'm very grateful for the work that they did.
Now they're hopeful that they will get justice for Rachel.
All that's left is to convince the jury.
In March of 2024, Zaki and Julie went to trial together for the murder of Rachel.
In their argument, Prosecutors say Rachel's murder was the result of a plot fueled by Julie's jealous rage.
The prosecution said that it was Julie's desire for revenge that led her to contact Zaki and orchestrate this murder-for-hire scheme.
She knew he was the type of person that would commit this type of crime.
Julie provided Zaki with the car and the information he needed to find Rachel.
For 2 months, Julie and Zaki planned every detail of how to kill Rachel.
There was time to get cold feet. There was time to rethink the plan or call it off.
But after months of planning, on the morning of April 11th, Zaki carried out the orchestrated hit.
She suspected nothing. Rachel was just stopping to get her son a treat.
Please stop!
He shot her in cold blood, and she died. And then he left. He fled.
Fortunately, Rachel's son did not have to relive that awful day on the stand during trial.
My nephew did not have to testify. They were able to use his video from the forensic interview, so we were very, very grateful for that.
When it's the defense's turn, they deny the allegations. Instead, they emphasize Aaron's role in it all.
Those representing Julie and Zaki tried to frame Aaron as a manipulative playboy.
But at the end of the day, right, Aaron did not pull the trigger, and Aaron did not hire someone to pull the trigger, right? Like, Aaron did not do those things.
While the defense succeeds in beating up on Aaron, their only real argument is that the prosecution got it wrong.
Zaki's lawyer simply claimed the entire case was built on circumstantial evidence and that there was nothing that directly connected his client to Rachel's murder. Not DNA evidence, not eyewitness identification, and not even the murder weapon, which was never discovered.
Julie's lawyer reiterates that although the prosecution has established a tragedy has taken place, they weren't able to connect Julie Jean in any way. But that argument fails to sway the jury.
The jury wasn't even in there for an hour. It was like 45 minutes.
The jury came back and found both Zaki and Julie guilty for the murder of Rachel King.
At sentencing, a judge sent Julie and Zaki to state prison for life.
We were very relieved when it came back guilty. But the two of them might as well have been robots. There was no, like, hanging of the head. There was no, like, oh my God.
I think they knew what they did, but I think they had no doubt in their mind that they were going to jail.
Now, some of Rachel's family wished the death penalty was used, but there hasn't been an execution since 1999 in Pennsylvania.
For his role in the murder of James Farrell, Zaki takes a plea deal and is sentenced to 20 to 40 years, which will run concurrently with his sentence for Rachel's murder.
The prosecution succeeded in finding justice for both Rachel and James.
But no sentence can bring Rachel back to her loved ones.
It hurt me more just knowing, like, my sister was an innocent bystander in this. And my nephew doesn't have his mom anymore.
If someone anywhere along that trajectory would have just said no and accepted the no, Rachel would still be here.
Still, Rachel's impact continues to be felt by her loved ones, her community, and most of all, her son.
Rachel's school, each year, they choose 4 8th graders. There's an award in her name that those students get. But there is no, like, you know, the thing we don't speak about. Like, that's not a thing. Like, we talk about her. There's very much that, like, just continuing to keep her presence here with us.
On the evening of April 30th, 2021, the countryside surrounding the small Italian town of Novellara appeared almost motionless. The fields stretched into the darkness, interrupted only by rows of cultivated land. Narrow farm roads, and isolated buildings that had become familiar landmarks for generations of agricultural workers. Nothing about that spring night suggested it would become one of the most haunting dates in modern Italian criminal history. There were no eyewitnesses running through the fields, no emergency calls reporting screams, no neighbors describing violence. There was only silence, broken occasionally by the ordinary sounds of a farming community preparing for another day of work. Yet hidden within that silence, security cameras were recording images that investigators would later replay hundreds of times. Those recordings would become some of the most important pieces of evidence in a case that forced Italy to confront difficult questions about family, freedom, immigration, and violence committed in the name of honor. The cameras did not capture a murder. They did not reveal what happened behind closed doors or beyond the reach of their lenses. Instead, they documented something far more unsettling in its simplicity. They showed an 18-year-old woman walking alongside the people she should have been safest, with her own family. She appeared to be heading toward the fields behind a farmhouse where they lived and worked. Nearby, other members of the family could also be seen. Investigators would later identify her uncle and 2 cousins in the area. Separate footage recorded individuals carrying tools including shovels, a crowbar, and digging equipment. At first glance, these might have appeared to be ordinary objects in an agricultural setting. Farmers use such tools every day. Nothing about them automatically suggested a crime. Yet after everything that followed, these ordinary images acquired an entirely different meaning. That young woman never appeared on camera again. Her name was Salman Abbas. In the days that followed, she seemed to vanish without explanation. Her family claimed that she had simply left home. They suggested she had run away, choosing to disappear on her own. Such stories are not uncommon. Young adults sometimes leave their families after disagreements, seeking independence or a fresh start elsewhere. If investigators had considered only that explanation, the case might have faded into another missing person report with few leads and little public attention. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. Salman's disappearance did not fit the pattern of someone voluntarily starting a new life. Her belongings remained behind. Her documents had not accompanied her. Her phone activity abruptly stopped. Her bank account showed no meaningful signs of use. There was no confirmed evidence that she had traveled anywhere after the final surveillance footage. Instead of new clues appearing with time, every passing day deepened the mystery. Then came another troubling development. Within only a few days of Salman's disappearance, several members of her family also vanished, but not in the same way. Her parents boarded a flight to Pakistan. Her uncle fled to France. 2 cousins left their residence. Rather than helping investigators locate an 18-year-old who was supposedly missing, the people closest to her were themselves becoming increasingly difficult to find. For Italian investigators, the case changed almost overnight. What had begun as a missing person investigation slowly transformed into something far more serious. Detectives began collecting surveillance recordings from around the family's farmhouse. They examined mobile phone records, electronic devices, and conversations preserved in digital messages. Piece by piece, they attempted to reconstruct the final days of a young woman who had already sought help from authorities before she disappeared. Those earlier requests for protection would become one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the entire investigation. Long before April 30th, Salman Abbas had told others that she feared her own family. She had resisted an arranged marriage. She had rejected plans to marry a cousin in Pakistan. After returning to Italy, she had continued her relationship with a boyfriend of her own choosing. She had removed her hijab. She had contacted social services, explaining that her passport had been withheld, that her movements were controlled, and that she feared being forced into a marriage she did not want. The concerns were taken seriously enough that authorities placed her in protected accommodation for a period of time. She had asked for help. That fact would echo throughout every stage of the investigation. Eventually, investigators also learned of messages she had exchanged with her boyfriend shortly before she disappeared. Among those messages was one sentence that would later be repeated in courtrooms, newspapers, documentaries, and discussions across Italy. It was a sentence that, in hindsight, sounded less like an ordinary conversation and more like a warning. If I disappear, it was my family. No one reading those words today can avoid wondering what she was feeling when she typed them. Yet the investigation did not rely on speculation about her emotions. Instead, prosecutors treated the messages as evidence that Salman herself had expressed fear before she vanished. Combined with surveillance footage, forensic analysis, digital records, and later discoveries, those messages became part of a much larger body of circumstantial evidence presented before the courts. As months passed without answers, the search expanded across the countryside surrounding Novellara. Police officers, forensic specialists, search dogs, heavy excavation equipment, and ground-penetrating technology were deployed again and again. The fields were examined repeatedly. Areas that appeared ordinary were searched in painstaking detail. Still, nothing was found. Weeks became months. Months became more than a year. Public attention grew, but the central mystery remained unsolved. Then, after more than 18 months, investigators searching near an abandoned farmhouse made a discovery that permanently altered the case. Human remains were found buried beneath the earth. DNA testing would later confirm what many had feared. The remains belonged to Salman Abbas. Although decomposition prevented forensic experts from reconstructing every detail of her final moments, the examination supported the conclusion that her death was a homicide. Investigators now had not only a missing person, but a confirmed murder victim. The search for Salman had become a search for those responsible for ending her life. What followed would develop into one of Italy's most closely watched criminal cases in recent years. The investigation crossed international borders. Arrests were made in multiple countries. Courts examined thousands of pages of evidence. Prosecutors argued that Salman had been killed because she refused an arranged marriage and chose to make her own decisions about love and her future. Defense lawyers challenged aspects of the prosecution's case, emphasizing the absence of eyewitnesses to the killing itself. Judges were ultimately asked to determine whether the combination of surveillance footage, digital evidence, forensic findings, and the conduct of multiple family members established responsibility beyond reasonable doubt. Yet beyond the legal arguments lay a deeper human story. Salman Abbas was not remembered simply because she became the victim of a notorious criminal investigation. She came to symbolize a larger conflict experienced by some young people growing up between different cultural expectations. She had been raised in Italy while living within a family that maintained traditions regarding marriage and family honor. According to prosecutors and later court findings, that conflict ultimately became fatal. This is not a story about sensational violence. It is not a mystery solved by a single dramatic clue or an unexpected confession. It is a story assembled patiently through fragments, camera footage, text messages, forensic science, international cooperation, and countless hours of investigative work. It is also the story of an 18-year-old woman who believed she should have the right to choose whom she loved and how she would live her own life. Before examining the investigation, the arrests, and the courtroom proceedings, we must first understand who Salman Abbas was, the world she grew up in, and the quiet but profound conflict that gradually unfolded long before she disappeared into the darkness of a spring night in northern Italy. To understand why the disappearance of Salman Abbas would eventually become one of the most significant criminal cases in modern Italy, it is necessary to look beyond the investigation itself. Before there were surveillance cameras, forensic examinations, international arrests, and courtroom arguments. There was simply a young woman trying to build a future she believed should belong to her. The legal proceedings would later focus on evidence, timelines, and criminal responsibility. But at the center of every document, every witness statement, and every judicial decision stood a single human life. Saman Abbas was born in 2002 in Pakistan. While she was still a child, her family left their homeland and immigrated to Italy, eventually settling in the small town of Novellara in the province of Reggio Emilia. Like many immigrant families who arrived in northern Italy seeking stability and opportunity, the Abbas family worked in agriculture. Their daily lives revolved around seasonal labor, fields, and the demanding routines of farming. Novellara itself was not a large city filled with crowds and anonymity. It was a quiet rural community surrounded by farmland, where agricultural work shaped the rhythm of everyday life. The area had welcomed many immigrant families over the years, particularly workers from South Asia who had become an important part of the local agricultural economy. For many newcomers, Italy represented the promise of employment, education, and security. Yet immigration also meant navigating two different worlds at the same time. Families often carried with them traditions, values, and expectations from their country of origin, while their children grew up immersed in an entirely different social environment. That contrast would eventually become central to Saman's story. As she grew older, Saman adapted to life in Italy. She attended school, learned Italian, made friends, and experienced the culture surrounding her in ways that naturally differed from those of her parents. Friends and acquaintances later describe her as someone who had integrated well into Italian society. She was growing into adulthood in a country where personal choice, especially regarding education, relationships, and marriage, was generally viewed as an individual right. Like countless other teenagers, she began imagining the kind of future she wanted for herself. There was nothing extraordinary about those dreams. They reflected the ordinary hopes of a young woman approaching adulthood, independence, love, and the freedom to make decisions about her own life. Yet inside her home, a different set of expectations remained firmly in place. According to investigators and later court proceedings, Saman's parents continued to follow traditional customs concerning family authority and marriage. The family maintained values that emphasized parental involvement in choosing a spouse and protecting what they viewed as family honor. These customs were not unique to one household, nor were they representative of every Pakistani family or every immigrant community. Nevertheless, in the Abbas household, prosecutors argued that these beliefs became increasingly incompatible with Saman's own aspirations. The conflict did not emerge overnight. It developed gradually as Saman grew older and became more independent. Every year she spent in Italy exposed her to new ideas about personal freedom and individual autonomy. Every year also widened the gap between her expectations for adulthood and the expectations her family held for her. Many immigrant families successfully navigate these cultural differences through communication, compromise, and mutual respect. In Saman's case, however, investigators concluded that the disagreements became progressively more serious. At some point during 2020, another important chapter in her life began. Saman entered a romantic relationship with a young man of Pakistani origin who was also living in Italy. The relationship itself was not unusual for two young adults growing up in the same country, but it represented a profound challenge to the plans her family had envisioned. According to the evidence later presented in court, her parents did not approve of the relationship. Their objection was not merely about the identity of the young man. Prosecutors argued that the larger issue was that Saman wanted to choose her own partner rather than accept one selected by her family. That difference transformed what might otherwise have been an ordinary family disagreement into a far more serious conflict. For Saman, love represented personal choice. According to prosecutors, for her family, the issue involved obedience, tradition, and family honor. These two perspectives moved further apart until reconciliation became increasingly difficult. During this same period, another visible change occurred. According to the investigation, after returning to Italy, Saman removed her hijab. This decision later became one of several documented examples showing that she wished to live differently from the expectations imposed upon her at home. The removal of the hijab was not treated by investigators as an isolated event, but rather as one element within a broader pattern of personal independence. She continued seeing her boyfriend despite her family's objections. She openly rejected the marriage being planned for her. Each of these decisions reflected her determination to shape her own future. None of these choices violated Italian law. Yet, according to prosecutors, together they were viewed inside her family as acts of defiance. The disagreement reached a turning point when Salman's family took her back to Pakistan during 2020. According to court documents, the purpose of the trip was to arrange her marriage to one of her cousins. The proposed marriage was not something Salman accepted willingly. Investigators later established that she repeatedly refused. She did not want to marry the man chosen for her. She wanted the freedom to decide whom she would spend her life with. The available evidence indicates that she resisted the arrangement throughout her stay. Eventually, she returned to Italy, but the conflict had not ended. If anything, it had intensified. The return to Italy marked the beginning of an increasingly difficult period. According to the investigation, Saman understood that the pressure to accept the arranged marriage had not disappeared. Instead of giving in, she continued making decisions that reflected her own wishes rather than those of her family. She maintained contact with her boyfriend. She rejected the proposed marriage. She attempted to exercise the independence she believed she had the right to enjoy. These actions, however, also increased the tension inside the household. Eventually, fearing that the situation might become dangerous, Saman reached out to Italian social services. This decision would later become one of the most important documented facts in the entire case, because it demonstrated that she had sought official protection before her disappearance. During her conversations with authorities, Saman reported several specific concerns. She stated that her passport had been taken from her. She explained that her communications were being monitored. She reported restrictions on seeing her boyfriend. She also described being threatened if she continued refusing the arranged marriage. These were not vague expressions of unhappiness. They were concrete allegations concerning control over her personal freedom. Italian authorities considered the information serious enough to intervene. As a result, Saman was placed in protected accommodation, away from the family home. This protective measure illustrated how concerned officials had become regarding her safety. Protected accommodation is not offered casually. It reflects an assessment that someone may face a significant risk if they remain in their current environment. For a period of time, Saman lived away from her family under the protection of social services. Even while living separately, she remained in contact with her boyfriend through messages and phone calls. Those communications would later become important pieces of evidence because they documented both her hopes and her fears during the final months of her life. Yet despite the protection provided by authorities, the emotional bond between Saman and her family did not simply disappear. Families are rarely defined only by conflict. Even in difficult circumstances, affection, hope, obligation, and longing often exist alongside fear. According to the evidence presented later, Saman's parents eventually contacted her and attempted to persuade her to return home. They reportedly told her that they had changed. They claimed they accepted her decisions and wanted reconciliation. Whether these assurances were sincere or not would become one of the central questions surrounding the tragedy that followed. What is known is that Salman chose to believe those promises. After spending time under protection, she returned to the family home in late April 2021. Looking back after the investigation concluded, that decision appears heartbreaking. At the time, however, it may have represented something far more ordinary, a young woman hoping that the people who had raised her truly wished to rebuild their relationship. There is no evidence that she expected what investigators would later allege had already been set in motion. She returned not as someone abandoning her dreams, but as someone who may have believed reconciliation was finally possible. Tragically, the days following her return would become the last days of her life. Before investigators reconstructed surveillance footage, before forensic teams searched the fields surrounding Novellara, before judges examined thousands of pages of evidence, there remained a brief period during which Salman was simply an 18-year-old daughter living once again under the same roof as her family, believing that perhaps the conflict defining the previous months had finally come to an end. The investigation would later reveal that the opposite may have been true. The quiet hope of reconciliation was about to give way to one of the most disturbing criminal investigations Italy had seen in years. And the final days of Salman Abbas would soon become the focus of an inquiry that crossed borders, challenged assumptions, and forever transformed her name into a symbol of the struggle against forced marriage and violence committed in the name of so-called family honor. By the final weeks of April 2021, the conflict that had shaped the previous year of Salman Abbas's life appeared, at least on the surface, to have entered a quieter phase. She was no longer living under the protection of social services. Instead, she had returned to the family home in Novellara after her parents reportedly assured her that they had accepted her decisions and wanted to reconcile. For an outside observer, this might have looked like the beginning of healing. Family disagreements, even serious ones, sometimes soften with time. Parents and children who have spent months apart occasionally find a way back to one another. It would not have seemed unreasonable for an 18-year-old daughter to hope that her family genuinely wished to move beyond the painful arguments that had defined the previous months. Yet investigators would later argue that beneath this appearance of reconciliation, the situation remained deeply dangerous. According to the prosecution's case, the disagreement had never truly been resolved. The fundamental issue, the conflict between Salman's determination to choose her own future and her family's insistence on an arranged marriage, had not disappeared. Instead, prosecutors alleged that it had reached its most critical stage. At the center of that conflict stood a young woman who had already demonstrated remarkable determination. She had refused an arranged marriage in Pakistan. She had continued her relationship with a boyfriend of her own choosing after returning to Italy. She had removed her hijab. She had contacted authorities when she feared for her safety. She had accepted protection from social services. Every one of those decisions reflected a desire to exercise control over her own life. But returning home placed her once again inside the environment from which she had previously sought protection. During those final days, Salman remained in contact with her boyfriend. Those conversations would later become among the most significant pieces of evidence presented. During the investigation, they offered investigators a glimpse into her state of mind shortly before she disappeared, not through speculation, but through her own documented words. According to the evidence later examined in court, Salman told her boyfriend that her parents still wanted to force her into marriage. She also expressed concern that her uncle was frequently present at the house and that she felt increasingly watched. Although investigators could not reconstruct every conversation between the couple, the surviving messages painted a consistent picture of someone who believed the danger had not completely passed. One message, in particular, would become one of the defining pieces of evidence in the entire case. Salman wrote to her boyfriend, If I disappear, it was my family. The sentence was short, direct, and devastating in retrospect. When investigators later discovered it, they did not treat it as proof of what happened by itself. Instead, they viewed it as an important element within a much larger collection of evidence. It showed that before her disappearance, Saman herself had identified the people she feared most. At the time she sent the message, however, no one could have known that these words would eventually be repeated in courtrooms and news reports across Italy. They remained simply a private warning shared between two young people trying to navigate an increasingly frightening situation. The final confirmed day of Saman's life was April 30th, 2021. Investigators would later spend years reconstructing the events of that day using every source of evidence available to them. Unlike many criminal investigations that rely heavily on eyewitness testimony, the reconstruction of Saman's final hours depended largely upon technology. Security cameras, digital records, and later forensic findings formed the backbone of the timeline. Throughout the day, nothing publicly documented suggested that an emergency was unfolding. There were no calls to police reporting violence. No neighbors came forward describing arguments or disturbances that evening. The case would later become notable precisely because so much of what investigators concluded had to be assembled from indirect evidence rather than direct observation. As daylight faded over the agricultural landscape surrounding Novellara, security cameras installed around the area continued recording their routine footage. Such cameras existed primarily for security, documenting the movement of vehicles and people around farms and nearby roads. On most nights, the recordings would likely never be reviewed by anyone. April 30th would prove to be an exception. The surveillance footage captured Saman walking together with her parents near the family property. At first glance, there was nothing obviously alarming about the images. A daughter walking with her parents in the evening would not ordinarily attract attention. Yet these recordings would later become extraordinarily significant because they represented the last verified images of Saman while she was still alive. As investigators expanded their review of surveillance footage from multiple cameras in the surrounding area, additional figures appeared within the timeline. According to the investigation, Saman's uncle, Danish Hasnan, was present near the fields that evening. Two of her cousins also appeared in the vicinity. Their presence alone did not establish criminal responsibility, but it became an important part of the sequence investigators carefully reconstructed. Another piece of surveillance footage proved especially significant. Cameras recorded individuals carrying agricultural tools, including shovels, a crowbar, and digging implements. Under ordinary circumstances, such equipment would not be unusual on farmland. Farmers routinely use shovels and similar tools as part of their daily work. Investigators, therefore, did not argue that the tools themselves demonstrated criminal intent. Rather, prosecutors later contended that their appearance, when considered together with everything else that occurred that night and afterward, became an important component of the overall evidentiary picture. Every detail mattered because no single piece of evidence alone explained what had happened. The investigation instead relied upon the cumulative weight of many different facts. According to the reconstructed timeline, Saman was seen moving toward the fields located behind the family's farmhouse. The surrounding area consisted largely of agricultural land, open spaces, and isolated structures. Darkness had already begun settling across the countryside, reducing visibility and making surveillance cameras even more valuable in establishing movement. Then, suddenly, the timeline stopped. No additional camera recorded Saman leaving the area. No footage showed her walking back toward the farmhouse. No images captured her traveling elsewhere. From that point forward, she effectively disappeared from the documented record. Investigators also examined digital evidence connected to her mobile phone. According to the investigation, her phone ceased activity that same night. For detectives experienced in missing person cases, this was a troubling development. Individuals who voluntarily leave home often continue using their phones, contacting friends, accessing social media, or making financial transactions. None of those expected signs appeared in Salman's case. Instead, the available evidence suggested an abrupt, incomplete end to her normal pattern of communication. As April turned into May, the silence surrounding Salman only deepened. Her boyfriend could no longer reach her. Friends received no messages. There were no confirmed sightings placing her anywhere outside the area where she had last been seen. En surveillance footage. Yet despite these facts, the explanation provided by her family was remarkably simple. They claimed that Salman had left home voluntarily. According to their account, she had run away. On its face, such an explanation might have appeared plausible. Young adults do sometimes leave home after conflicts with their parents. However, investigators quickly identified several circumstances that did not align with the theory of a voluntary disappearance. Salman's personal belongings remained behind. Important documents had not accompanied her. Her bank account showed no evidence of supporting a new life elsewhere. Her phone had gone silent. Most importantly, there was no confirmed evidence that she had traveled away from the area after the surveillance cameras recorded her final movements. Each inconsistency increased investigators' concerns. Then another development fundamentally changed the direction of the case. Within only a short time after Salman's disappearance, members of her family themselves began leaving Italy. Her parents boarded a flight to Pakistan. Her uncle fled to France. 2 cousins also left their residence. Investigators found these departures highly significant. If Salman had truly chosen to disappear voluntarily, the sudden departure of multiple close relatives raised obvious questions. Rather than remaining available to assist police in locating a missing family member, several individuals who had been among the last people known to see her alive were now outside the reach of Italian authorities or difficult to locate. Although investigators still lacked direct evidence proving what had happened during the night of April 30th, the pattern of events increasingly suggested that this was no ordinary missing person investigation. The surveillance footage established Salman's final confirmed movements. Her digital communications documented her fear before disappearing. Her phone activity ended abruptly. She never reappeared on camera. Her family offered an explanation that investigators believed was inconsistent with the available evidence. And shortly afterward, several key family members left the country. Taken individually, each fact answered only part of the mystery. Together, they convinced investigators that Salman Abbas had likely not left voluntarily. What had initially appeared to be the disappearance of an 18-year-old woman was rapidly becoming a homicide investigation. Yet at that stage, investigators still faced one enormous obstacle. They had no body, no confirmed crime scene, and no direct witness who could describe exactly what had happened after Salman walked toward the fields on that spring evening. Solving the case would require painstaking work, patience, and the careful assembly of hundreds of separate pieces of evidence. The search for answers was only beginning, and over the months that followed, detectives, forensic specialists, and prosecutors would undertake one of the most exhaustive investigations in recent Italian criminal history. Determined to uncover what had happened after the surveillance cameras recorded the final known images of Salman Abbas alive. When Salman Abbas disappeared in the early hours of May 1st, 2021, Italian investigators were confronted with one of the most difficult situations any homicide inquiry can face. There was no confirmed crime scene. There was no body. There was no eyewitness who could describe what had happened after the young woman walked toward the fields behind her family's farmhouse. There was no confession, no murder weapon, and no direct evidence showing the exact moment her life ended. What investigators did have was a growing collection of troubling inconsistencies, digital records, surveillance footage, and the behavior of the people who had been closest to Salman during her final hours. Solving the case would not depend on discovering one dramatic clue. Instead, it would require patiently assembling hundreds of small pieces of information until they formed a coherent picture. Every timeline, every message, every movement captured by security cameras, and every statement given by those involved would be examined repeatedly. The investigation became an exercise in methodical reconstruction, where seemingly ordinary details gradually acquired extraordinary significance. One of the first priorities for investigators was to establish a complete chronology of Salman's final days. Detectives collected surveillance footage from around the family's property and surrounding roads. They synchronized timestamps from multiple cameras to determine precisely who had been present and when. The recordings became the foundation upon which the investigation was built. Unlike eyewitness testimony, surveillance footage could not forget, exaggerate, or unintentionally alter events over time. It simply recorded what passed in front of its lenses. Although the cameras did not capture the killing itself, the documented movements that prosecutors later argued were essential to understanding what happened. Investigators carefully traced Salman's final confirmed appearance. The footage showed her walking with her parents toward the agricultural land behind the farmhouse. Other recordings identified the presence of her uncle, Danish Hassanen, and two cousins in the same general area that evening. Perhaps most importantly, cameras also captured individuals carrying agricultural tools, including shovels, digging equipment, and a crowbar. On farmland, such objects would ordinarily appear unremarkable. Farmers routinely transport tools as part of their daily work. Investigators therefore avoided drawing conclusions based solely on those images. Instead, they viewed the recordings in combination with everything that followed. The significance of the tools emerged only after Salman disappeared without explanation, and investigators began questioning the family's account of events. Digital evidence soon became another critical pillar of the investigation. Specialists recovered and examined mobile phone records, electronic devices, and communication histories connected to the individuals involved. Among the most important discoveries were the messages exchanged between Salman and her boyfriend during the final period of her life. These communications provided investigators with a documented record of concerns Salman had expressed before she vanished. Unlike recollections given months later, text messages preserved the exact words that had been written at the time. Investigators regarded them as especially valuable because they reflected Salman's own statements before her disappearance rather than interpretations formed afterward. The message that attracted the greatest attention was the one in which Salman warned, "If I disappear, it was my family." Prosecutors later argued that this statement demonstrated her fear and reinforced the significance of other evidence pointing toward members of her household. However, investigators did not rely on this message in isolation. They understood that criminal cases cannot be solved through emotion or assumption. Every claim had to be supported by independent evidence. Consequently, detectives continued comparing the digital timeline with surveillance footage, travel records, and witness statements to determine whether all available information pointed toward the same conclusion. As investigators reconstructed Salman's final movements, they also scrutinized the explanation offered by her family. According to relatives, Salman had voluntarily left home. At first glance, such a claim could not simply be dismissed. Adults sometimes choose to leave difficult family situations without informing relatives of their destination. Detectives therefore approached the explanation systematically rather than emotionally. They examined whether the available evidence supported the theory that Salman had begun a new life elsewhere. The results increasingly suggested otherwise. Her personal belongings remained at home. Important documents were still in the family's possession. Her bank account showed no meaningful activity consistent with someone establishing an independent life. Her phone stopped communicating entirely after the night she disappeared. There were no verified sightings placing her outside the area recorded by surveillance cameras. Every investigative step produced the same troubling result. Evidence expected in a voluntary disappearance was absent. At the same time, another pattern began attracting investigators' attention. Shortly after Saman vanished, several close relatives left Italy. Her parents traveled to Pakistan. Her uncle fled to France. 2 cousins also left their residence. These departures did not by themselves establish criminal guilt, but detectives regarded them as highly significant. Normally, family members searching for a missing daughter would be expected to cooperate closely with investigators. Instead, several individuals who had been among the last known people to see Saman alive became increasingly difficult for Italian authorities to question. This development intensified the investigation and expanded its international dimension. While detectives continued collecting documentary evidence, search teams focused on the area surrounding the farmhouse. The challenge was enormous. Northern Italy's agricultural landscape covers extensive fields, irrigation channels, abandoned structures, and large areas of cultivated land. Searching such terrain requires both time and specialized equipment. Officers conducted repeated examinations using trained search dogs capable of detecting human remains. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed to identify disturbances beneath the soil. Heavy excavation machinery assisted in investigating locations that appeared potentially significant. Large sections of farmland were searched multiple times. Days became weeks, and weeks became months. Despite these extensive efforts, investigators initially found nothing that could confirm Saman's fate. The absence of immediate forensic evidence created one of the investigation's greatest frustrations. Without a body, prosecutors faced obvious limitations in reconstructing exactly how Saman had died. Public attention continued to grow as media outlets reported on the missing teenager whose disappearance had become increasingly suspicious. The longer the search continued without results, the more difficult the investigation became. Some observers wondered whether the body had been moved elsewhere. Others questioned whether investigators were searching the correct locations. Yet detectives persisted. Rather than abandoning the inquiry, they continued reviewing evidence already collected, searching for inconsistencies or overlooked details that might identify new locations requiring examination. During this period, investigators also conducted interviews with individuals connected to the case. Among those questioned was Saman's uncle, Danish Hassanen. According to the investigation, his statements changed over time. Detectives regarded these inconsistencies as important because reliable witness accounts generally remain stable regarding major events. While changes in memory can occur naturally, repeated alterations to significant aspects of testimony often prompt investigators to examine such statements more closely. Prosecutors later argued that the uncle's inconsistent accounts formed another element supporting their overall theory of the case. Once again, however, investigators did not rely upon any single inconsistency. Every interview was evaluated alongside surveillance footage, digital records, travel information, and forensic evidence. The investigation advanced through accumulation rather than dramatic revelation. More than 18 months after Saman's disappearance, the case reached its most significant turning point. In November 2022, search teams returned to the countryside near an abandoned farmhouse not far from where Saman's family had worked. Investigators had expanded their search based upon continuing analysis of the available evidence. During these operations, they discovered a concealed burial site. Inside the grave were human remains. Although investigators strongly suspected they had finally found Saman, Scientific confirmation remained essential. The remains were recovered carefully according to forensic procedures and submitted for DNA analysis. In January 2023, the laboratory results provided the answer investigators had sought for more than a year and a half. The DNA matched Salman Abbas. The missing person investigation had become a confirmed homicide inquiry. The discovery profoundly altered the direction of the case. Investigators could now conduct a forensic examination of the remains, although the long passage of time imposed serious limitations. More than 18 months underground had resulted in extensive decomposition. As forensic specialists explained, this made it impossible to reconstruct every detail of Salman's final moments. Nevertheless, the examination produced important findings. Experts concluded that the death was not natural. They identified injuries to the neck consistent with strangulation, although the condition of the remains prevented a complete reconstruction of every injury or the precise sequence of events leading to death. Even with those limitations, forensic experts determined that the manner of death was homicide. They also concluded that the body had been buried shortly after death in an apparent effort to conceal the crime. These scientific findings became another major component of the prosecution's case. By this stage, investigators had assembled an extensive body of circumstantial evidence. Surveillance footage documented Salman's final confirmed movements. Digital communications preserved her warnings and fears before she disappeared. Her phone activity ended abruptly on the same night. The family's explanation of a voluntary disappearance was contradicted by the absence of supporting evidence. Multiple relatives left Italy soon afterward. Search operations eventually located Salman's remains buried near the family's workplace. Forensic examination established that she had died as the result of homicide. None of these elements alone answered every question surrounding the case. Together, however, prosecutors argued that they formed a consistent and compelling narrative. Based on the totality of the investigation, Italian authorities concluded that there was sufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges against 5 members of Salman's family: her father, her mother, her uncle Danish Hassanin, and her 2 cousins. Prosecutors alleged that the killing had not been a spontaneous act, but the result of collective planning motivated by Salman's refusal to accept an arranged marriage and her determination to choose her own future. The investigation that began with the disappearance of an 18-year-old woman had evolved into one of Italy's most closely watched homicide cases. Years of painstaking police work, international cooperation, forensic science, digital analysis, and careful examination of circumstantial evidence had transformed uncertainty into a prosecutable case. Yet the ultimate question of criminal responsibility still remained. That decision would belong not to investigators, but to the courts, where every piece of evidence would be challenged, every argument tested, and every conclusion examined under the strict standards of Italian criminal justice. By the time the investigation into the death of Salman Abbas reached the courtroom, the case had already attracted national and international attention. It was no longer viewed solely as the disappearance of an 18-year-old woman from a small farming town in northern Italy. Instead, it had become a case that raised difficult legal, social, and moral questions about forced marriage, family authority, and violence committed in the name of so-called honor. For investigators, the years of painstaking work had resulted in a substantial body of evidence. For prosecutors, the challenge was now to persuade the court that those individual pieces of evidence, when considered together, proved beyond reasonable doubt that Salman had been deliberately killed by members of her own family. The defense, meanwhile, would argue that the evidence remained circumstantial and that no witness had directly observed the killing itself. The courtroom would become the place where every fact collected during the investigation would be examined, questioned, and measured against the standards of Italian criminal law. The prosecution's central argument was that Salman Abbas had not died as the result of a sudden argument or an isolated act of violence. According to prosecutors, the evidence indicated a coordinated plan involving multiple members of her family. They argued that Salman's refusal to accept an arranged marriage, her decision to continue her relationship with her boyfriend, and her determination to choose her own future had been viewed within the family as an unacceptable rejection of their authority and a violation of what they considered family honor. Prosecutors presented this alleged motive not as speculation, but as a conclusion supported by the documented conflict that had existed for months before Salman disappeared. They reminded the court that she had previously sought help from Italian social services because she feared being forced into marriage. They emphasized that she had reported her passport being withheld, restrictions placed upon her communications, and threats connected to her refusal to marry the man chosen for her. These earlier events demonstrated that the conflict had existed long before the night of April 30th, 2021. The prosecution also highlighted the sequence of events surrounding Salman's return home. After spending time under the protection of social services, she had reportedly been persuaded to return because her parents assured her that they had accepted her choices and wished to reconcile. Yet only days later, according to the reconstructed timeline, she disappeared forever. Prosecutors argued that this sequence could not be viewed in isolation but had to be considered alongside every other piece of evidence uncovered during the investigation. One of the strongest elements of the prosecution's presentation involved the surveillance footage collected from around the family's property. Although the cameras did not record the killing itself, they established a timeline that prosecutors described as highly significant. The recordings showed Salman walking with her parents on the evening of April 30th, 2021. They also placed her uncle and 2 cousins in the vicinity during the same period. Additional footage documented individuals carrying shovels, digging tools, and a crowbar. Prosecutors carefully avoided suggesting that the tools alone proved criminal intent. Instead, they argued that the footage acquired evidentiary value when considered together with the later discovery of Salman's buried remains and the fact that no camera ever recorded her leaving the area alive. Every image contributed another piece to the broader reconstruction of events. Digital evidence occupied another central position during the trial. The messages exchanged between Salman and her boyfriend became some of the most emotionally powerful exhibits presented before the court. Prosecutors reminded the judges that these communications had been written before Salman disappeared, and therefore represented her own words rather than later interpretations. Particular attention focused on the message in which she wrote, "If I disappear, it was my family." Prosecutors argued that this statement reflected the fear she had expressed before her disappearance, and was consistent with the broader pattern established by her previous requests for protection from social services. Yet they also emphasized that the prosecution's case did not depend upon that message alone. The digital communications were presented as one element within a much larger body of evidence that included surveillance footage, forensic findings, travel records, and witness testimony. The forensic evidence introduced during the trial reflected both the strengths and limitations of the investigation. Experts explained that because Salman's remains had been buried for more than 18 months before being discovered, decomposition had made it impossible to reconstruct every detail of her final moments. Nevertheless, forensic specialists testified that the remains displayed injuries to the neck consistent with strangulation and that the death had been classified as a homicide. They further explained that the body had been buried shortly after death, an act they concluded was intended to conceal the crime. Although forensic science could not identify every action that occurred on the night of April 30th, prosecutors argued that the scientific findings strongly supported the conclusion that Salman had been deliberately killed and secretly buried. Another important aspect of the prosecution's case involved the conduct of family members after Saman disappeared. Prosecutors pointed to the fact that her parents left Italy for Pakistan shortly afterward, while her uncle fled to France and her cousins also left their residence. They argued that these departures were inconsistent with the behavior one might expect from relatives searching for a missing daughter. Again, prosecutors did not claim that travel alone established guilt. Instead, they invited the court to consider these actions alongside every other element of the case. The investigation had never relied upon a single decisive fact. Its strength, according to prosecutors, lay in the consistency of numerous independent pieces of evidence that all pointed toward the same conclusion. During the proceedings, the defense challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. Defense lawyers argued that no witness had directly observed the killing. No surveillance camera captured the fatal act itself. The precise sequence of events after Saman disappeared from view could not be reconstructed with complete certainty. They emphasized that the prosecution's theory rested largely upon circumstantial evidence and urged the court to distinguish suspicion from proof beyond reasonable doubt. The defense questioned whether the available evidence was sufficient to establish the individual criminal responsibility of every accused family member. These arguments reflected a fundamental principle of criminal justice. Serious accusations require careful examination, and convictions must rest upon evidence rather than assumption. The court therefore faced the task of evaluating not isolated facts, but the cumulative weight of the entire investigation. Judges reviewed the surveillance recordings, the digital communications, forensic reports, witness testimony, travel records, and investigative findings gathered over several years. Rather than asking whether any single piece of evidence conclusively proved guilt, the court considered whether the combination of all available evidence formed a coherent and convincing account of what had occurred. In 2023, the first major verdicts were delivered. Saman Abbas's father was sentenced to life imprisonment. Her mother, who had been tried in absentia because she remained outside Italy at that stage, also received a life sentence. Her uncle, Danish Hasnan, was convicted and sentenced to 14 years in prison. The two cousins, however, were acquitted during the initial proceedings. The mixed verdict reflected the court's differing assessment of the evidence presented against each defendant at that stage of the judicial process. Yet the legal proceedings were not over. Under the Italian judicial system, significant criminal cases frequently continue through appellate review, allowing both prosecutors and defense lawyers to challenge aspects of the original judgment. The prosecution appealed portions of the verdict, arguing that the evidence demonstrated broader participation than the trial court had recognized. The appeal proceedings culminated in a landmark decision in 2025. After reviewing the evidence again, the appellate court reached a different conclusion regarding the involvement of the two cousins. The court determined that the evidence supported their participation in the crime and sentenced both to life imprisonment. The sentence imposed upon Danish Hasnan was also increased from 14 years to 22 years. Meanwhile, the life sentences previously imposed upon Saman's father and mother were upheld. The appellate judgment reflected the court's conclusion that multiple members of the family had participated in the events leading to Saman's death. Even after the appellate ruling, however, the legal process continued. By the middle of 2026, the case had reached Italy's Court of Cassation, the country's highest court for criminal matters. The Cassation Court does not ordinarily retry the facts of a case. Instead, it examines questions concerning the correct application of law and judicial procedure. Prosecutors requested that the appellate convictions and sentences remain in place. Because of the complexity of the case, the final hearing was postponed, and a definitive ruling remained pending. The continuation of the legal process demonstrated both the seriousness of the case and the safeguards built into the Italian justice system, where convictions for the most serious crimes undergo multiple levels of judicial review before becoming final. Beyond the courtroom, the impact of Saman Abbas's case extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Her death became one of Italy's most widely discussed examples of violence associated with forced marriage and so-called honor. Public debate intensified concerning how authorities should identify and protect young people who report threats from their own families. Social workers, educators, legal experts, and advocacy organizations examined whether existing protection systems could be strengthened for individuals facing similar risks. The case also prompted broader discussions about the challenges experienced by some young people growing up between different cultural expectations. Throughout those discussions, many observers emphasized an important distinction. The actions alleged in this case reflected the conduct of specific individuals, not an entire community, culture, or religion. Millions of immigrant families successfully balance tradition with respect for personal choice, and countless parents support their children's autonomy while preserving their cultural identity. The tragedy of Saman Abbas, therefore, came to symbolize not a clash between cultures, but the consequences of violence and coercion directed against an individual who sought the freedom to make decisions about her own life. Today, Saman Abbas is remembered not only because of the extraordinary investigation that followed her disappearance, but because her story continues to remind societies of the importance of protecting vulnerable young people when they seek help. She had spoken to authorities before she vanished. She had described her fears. She had resisted a marriage she did not choose. She had believed that she should have the right to decide her own future. Those facts remain at the heart of her story. The legal proceedings sought to determine criminal responsibility for her death. But the broader legacy of the case reaches beyond the courtroom. It serves as a solemn reminder that the right to choose one's own path, to refuse coercion, and to live free from violence is not merely an abstract principle. For Saman Abbas, those choices defined her final months, and after years of investigation, international cooperation, and judicial scrutiny, her name has become a lasting symbol of the ongoing effort to protect those whose search for freedom places them at greatest risk. The criminal proceedings surrounding the death of Saman Abbas sought to answer a specific legal question. Who was responsible for her killing? Courts examined evidence. Investigators reconstructed timelines. Forensic experts presented scientific findings, and judges weighed competing legal arguments before reaching their decisions. Yet even after years of investigation and multiple levels of judicial review, the case left behind questions that no verdict alone could fully resolve. Those questions were not about guilt or innocence, but about prevention. They concerned what happens when a young person asks for protection, how societies respond to conflicts within families, and whether tragedies like this can be prevented before they become criminal cases. Saman's story ultimately became far more than the record of a homicide investigation. It became a symbol of a wider conversation taking place throughout Italy about personal freedom, forced marriage, and the responsibility of institutions to protect vulnerable individuals whose greatest perceived danger may come from within their own households. One of the most striking aspects of Saman's case is that her fears were not revealed only after her disappearance, long before investigators searched fields outside Novellara, before surveillance footage was analyzed frame by frame, and before prosecutors presented evidence in court. Saman herself had sought help. She had approached Italian social services and explained that she feared being forced into an arranged marriage. According to the evidence presented during the investigation, she reported that her passport had been withheld, that her communications were restricted, and that she was prevented from freely seeing her boyfriend. These are not concerns discovered in hindsight. They were documented before she vanished. Authorities considered the information sufficiently serious to place her in protected accommodation. This fact became one of the most heartbreaking elements of the entire case because it demonstrated that the danger had been recognized before the crime investigators later alleged had occurred. At the same time, the case also illustrated the complexity of protecting individuals facing family-related threats. Protection cannot rely solely upon physical separation. Emotional bonds between parents and children remain powerful, even after prolonged conflict. Families often experience periods of reconciliation following serious disagreements. Parents may promise change. Children may hope that relationships can be repaired. Such hopes are deeply human. According to the evidence presented during the trial, Saman returned home after her parents reportedly told her they had accepted her choices and wanted the family to reunite. Looking backward through the lens of the investigation, that decision appears tragic. Yet it is important to remember that decisions are made based on what people believe at the time, not on information that only becomes available afterward. The legal proceedings established that Saman had returned to her family shortly before disappearing, but they could never reveal exactly what she believed would happen in those final days. Her decision reflected the difficult emotional reality experienced by many young people who remain connected to families despite serious conflict. The case also generated extensive public discussion about forced marriage. Throughout the proceedings, prosecutors argued that Saman was killed because she refused to marry the person selected for her and instead insisted upon choosing her own partner. According to the court's findings, this refusal lay at the center of the conflict that ultimately ended her life. In response, organizations working in the fields of women's rights and child protection pointed to the case as evidence of the importance of recognizing warning signs when individuals report coercion surrounding marriage. Public attention focused on understanding how social institutions, schools, community organizations, and local authorities can identify situations in which young people may face serious risks if they're denied the freedom to make decisions about their own future. Another significant discussion concerned the experiences of children growing up in immigrant families. Saman had been born in Pakistan but raised largely in Italy. She spoke Italian, attended school, formed friendships, and developed expectations about adulthood influenced by the society in which she grew up. At home, however, investigators concluded that traditional expectations concerning marriage and family authority continued to shape family life. Many observers describe this as an example of the difficult balance some immigrant families navigate between preserving cultural traditions and adapting to the legal and social norms of new country. Yet the case also prompted repeated reminders that cultural background alone cannot explain criminal violence. Millions of immigrant families throughout Italy and across Europe successfully reconciled different traditions while respecting the personal autonomy of their children. The overwhelming majority never experienced conflicts of this nature. For that reason, discussions surrounding Saman's death increasingly emphasized individual criminal responsibility rather than broad generalizations about entire communities. The tragedy resulted from the actions alleged against specific individuals, not from the identity of an entire culture, nationality, or religion. Maintaining that distinction became an essential part of responsible public discussion following the trial. The investigation itself also demonstrated the remarkable role that modern forensic science and digital technology now play in criminal justice. Unlike many historic homicide cases that depended primarily upon eyewitness testimony or confessions, the investigation into Saman's disappearance relied heavily upon objective forms of evidence. Surveillance cameras documented movements during the final evening. Mobile phone records and electronic communications helped reconstruct relationships and timelines. Digital messages preserved Salman's own words exactly as she had written them. Ground-penetrating radar, forensic archaeology, DNA testing, and scientific examination of human remains all contributed essential pieces of information. No single technological tool solved the case independently. Instead, investigators combined numerous forms of evidence to build a coherent reconstruction capable of withstanding judicial scrutiny. The case illustrated how modern investigations increasingly depend upon careful integration of digital records, forensic science, and traditional detective work rather than dramatic breakthroughs or isolated discoveries. Another enduring aspect of the investigation was the extensive international cooperation required to bring the accused before Italian courts. Following Salman's disappearance, members of her family traveled outside Italy. According to the investigation, her parents returned to Pakistan, while her uncle fled to France. The prosecution of the case, therefore, depended not only upon domestic police work, but also upon cooperation between multiple countries, including extradition procedures and assistance involving international law enforcement. Such cooperation reflected the reality that modern criminal investigations frequently extend beyond national borders, particularly when suspects or evidence move between different jurisdictions. Without that international collaboration, the judicial process would have faced far greater obstacles. For many Italians, the name Salman Abbas gradually came to represent more than a single criminal file. Her story became associated with campaigns raising awareness about forced marriage, coercion, and violence committed in the name of so-called family honor. Educational initiatives, public discussions, and advocacy efforts increasingly referenced her case as an example of why young people must be able to seek help safely when they fear violence within their own families. Her name appeared not simply in legal documents, but also in conversations about prevention, education, and the importance of ensuring that vulnerable individuals know where to find support before conflicts escalate into irreversible tragedy. Throughout these discussions, one principle consistently emerged. Every individual has the right to make fundamental decisions about marriage and personal relationships free from violence or coercion. The legal proceedings surrounding Salman's death reinforced that principle by addressing the criminal allegations before the courts, while the broader public conversation focused on preventing similar cases in the future. Yet despite the social significance the case acquired, it is important not to lose sight of the individual whose life became the center of those discussions. Public attention often transforms victims into symbols. Their names become associated with movements, legal reforms, or national debates. While such recognition can help raise awareness, it can also unintentionally reduce a person to the circumstances of their death. Before becoming the subject of one of Italy's most widely discussed criminal investigations, Salman Abbas was simply a young woman at the beginning of adulthood. She had dreams, relationships, hopes, and plans that extended beyond the legal proceedings that would eventually bear her name. According to the evidence presented during the investigation, she wished to choose whom she loved and how she would build her future. Those aspirations were neither extraordinary nor controversial within the society in which she had grown up. They reflected the ordinary expectations of many young adults preparing to enter independent life. The tragedy lies not only in the fact that her life ended at 18 years of age, but also in the future she never had the opportunity to create. Looking back over the entire chronology of the case, certain moments stand out with particular clarity. There was the decision to refuse an arranged marriage despite intense family pressure. There was the courage to seek help from social services when she believed she was in danger. There were the messages exchanged with her boyfriend during the final days of her life, including the warning that investigators would later examine so carefully. There was the final surveillance footage showing her walking toward the fields with members of her Family. There followed 18 months of uncertainty before investigators located her remains and confirmed her identity through DNA analysis. Finally came years of judicial proceedings in which prosecutors, defense lawyers, forensic experts, investigators, and judges sought to establish the truth according to the evidence available. Each of these moments formed part of a single story, but none can fully define the person at its center. The legal process aimed to determine responsibility for a crime. History will likely remember the case for its importance in discussions about forced marriage and honor-based violence. Yet perhaps the most meaningful way to remember Saman Abbas is far simpler. She was an 18-year-old woman who believed that the decision of whom to marry should belong to her alone. She believed that she should have the freedom to choose her own future. She sought help when she feared those choices might place her in danger. Those documented facts remain the most enduring part of her story. The investigations, arrests, trials, appeals, and legal arguments all followed because that fundamental freedom, according to the findings of the courts, was ultimately denied through violence. The legacy of Saman Abbas therefore reaches beyond court judgments or prison sentences. It serves as a lasting reminder that every request for help deserves careful attention, that every report of coercion must be taken seriously, and that protecting vulnerable individuals often requires not only legal authority, but also sustained compassion, vigilance, and cooperation across institutions and communities. In the end, while the courts sought justice through the rule of law, the memory of Saman Abbas continues to challenge society with a quieter question: whether future young people facing similar fears will find safety before they become the subject of another investigation, another trial, and another story of a life cut tragically short. In the years following the disappearance and confirmed death of Saman Abbas, her name became permanently connected with one of the most closely followed criminal cases in Italy. Yet behind the legal documents, courtroom arguments, and public discussions was a simple truth that remained unchanged. Before she became the center of a national debate, Saman was a young woman whose life had barely begun. She was 18 years old. She had grown up in Italy, formed her own ideas about the future, built relationships outside her family, and believed that she should have the ability to make personal decisions about her own life. The tragedy of her death was not only that a crime occurred, but that the hopes and possibilities of a young person were taken away before they could fully develop. The story of Saman Abbas continues to be remembered because it represents a conflict that extends beyond one family and one courtroom. It reflects the difficult situations that can arise when individual freedom, family expectations, and social traditions come into direct conflict. Her case forced many people in Italy to confront uncomfortable questions about how authorities respond when a person seeks protection from those closest to them. It raised discussions about whether warning signs are always recognized quickly enough, whether vulnerable individuals feel safe enough to ask for help, and whether institutions have the tools necessary to intervene before a situation becomes irreversible. One of the most important aspects of Saman's story is that she was not silent. According to the evidence presented during the investigation, she expressed her fears before she disappeared. She contacted social services. She explained her concerns about being forced into a marriage she did not want. She maintained communication with her boyfriend and shared her worries about her situation. Her messages showed that she understood the seriousness of the conflict surrounding her. The investigation later revealed that her fears were not without foundation. This aspect of the case created a lasting impact because it changed the way many people viewed situations involving family pressure and forced marriage. Such situations are sometimes hidden behind the appearance of private family disagreements. From the outside, a conflict between parents and a child may appear temporary or ordinary. But Saman's case demonstrated that some conflicts can involve much deeper issues of control, personal freedom, and safety. It reminded authorities, communities, and individuals that requests for help must be taken seriously, especially when someone reports feeling threatened by people who should traditionally be their source of protection. The case also became a symbol in discussions about the concept of honor when it is used to justify control or violence. Prosecutors argued that Saman was killed because she refused to accept an arranged marriage and chose to live according to her own decisions. The courts examined these allegations through the evidence presented during the trials. Beyond the legal conclusions, however, the broader social discussion focused on a fundamental principle. No idea of family reputation or social expectation can justify taking away another person's freedom through violence. At the same time, the public conversation surrounding Saman's case required careful consideration. The tragedy involved the actions and responsibilities of specific individuals accused and convicted. Through the judicial process, it did not represent an entire culture, nationality, or community. Many families from diverse backgrounds successfully balance traditional values with respect for personal choices and individual rights. Reducing the case to a conflict between cultures would ignore the complexity of what happened and overlook the central issue: the alleged decisions of individuals who chose violence rather than acceptance. For investigators, Saman's case demonstrated the importance of persistence. The search lasted more than 18 months. Police officers, forensic specialists, and investigators continued working despite the absence of immediate answers. They relied on surveillance recordings, digital evidence, witness statements, forensic analysis, and international cooperation to reconstruct events that no one had directly witnessed. The discovery of Saman's remains and the confirmation through DNA testing provided her family, investigators, and the public with an answer to the question that had remained unresolved for so long. However, finding the truth did not erase the loss. The discovery of Saman's remains confirmed what many had feared, but it also marked the end of uncertainty. For months, there had been questions about where she was, whether she was alive, and whether she might return. The forensic confirmation brought a painful reality. The young woman who had disappeared from Navalara would never return to continue the life she had imagined. The court proceedings that followed were an attempt to transform that painful reality into justice. Judges examined evidence gathered over years of investigation. Prosecutors presented their reconstruction of events. Defense lawyers challenged the interpretation of the evidence and emphasized the absence of direct witnesses. Through multiple levels of judicial review, Italian courts evaluated the responsibility of each accused individual. The final outcome of the legal process was shaped by the standards of criminal justice, requiring careful examination rather than emotional judgment. Yet for many people following the case, the most powerful evidence was not only found in surveillance footage or forensic reports. It was found in the small details of Saman's life, her decision to ask for help, her desire to choose her own future, and her belief that she should have the same freedoms as other young people around her. These details transformed her from a name in a criminal file into a person whose story affected thousands of people. The memory of Saman Abbas continues to serve as a reminder of the importance of listening. Listening when someone says they are afraid. Listening when someone says they are being pressured. Listening when someone says they do not have control over decisions that should belong to them. Her case showed that danger is not always visible from the outside. Sometimes the most important warnings are spoken quietly, through conversations, messages, or requests for protection that may appear ordinary until it is too late. The legacy of Saman's story is therefore not only about the crime committed against her. It is also about the responsibility of society to recognize vulnerability and respond before tragedy. occurs. Her name became associated with campaigns and discussions about forced marriage and violence-based on so-called family honor because people saw in her story a warning about the consequences of ignoring signs of danger. But perhaps the most meaningful way to remember Saman is not through the circumstances of her death, but through the life she wanted to live. She wanted the ability to make her own choices. She wanted to decide whom she loved. She wanted a future shaped by her own decisions rather than one determined entirely by others. Those wishes were ordinary, but for her, they became the center of a conflict that ultimately ended in tragedy. Years after her disappearance, the fields near Novellara remain connected to a story that began with a missing young woman and developed into one of Italy's most significant criminal cases. The investigation may eventually reach its final legal conclusion, but the questions raised by Saman's story will continue beyond any courtroom decision. Her name remains a reminder that behind every criminal case is a person whose life cannot be reduced to evidence, verdicts, or headlines. Saman Abbas was not only a victim of a crime. She was a daughter, a friend, and a young woman with hopes for the future. Remembering her means recognizing the human being behind the case file and understanding why the protection of personal freedom, dignity, and safety remains a responsibility shared by every society. The story of Saman Abbas ended on a dark night in the countryside of northern Italy. But the conversation her life created continues. It is a conversation about courage, protection, justice, and the simple but fundamental idea that every person deserves the right to choose their own path. The story of Saman Abbas does not end with a courtroom verdict, a prison sentence, or the closing of an investigation file. Legal proceedings can determine responsibility according to evidence and the standards of justice, but they cannot restore the life that was lost. They cannot return an 18-year-old woman to the future she once imagined. They cannot erase the final moments of fear and uncertainty that surrounded her disappearance. What remains after such a case is not only a record of what happened, but also a continuing reflection on why it happened and what must be understood to prevent similar tragedies. When people look back at the case of Saman Abbas, one of the most painful elements is the fact that her struggle was visible before her disappearance. Her fears were not discovered only after investigators began searching for answers. They existed in her own words, in the messages she sent, and in the decision she made to seek protection. She had already taken the difficult step of telling authorities that she felt trapped by circumstances she cannot accept. She had already tried to find a way to live according to her own choices. Her story, therefore, became a reminder that many victims of family-related violence do not remain silent. They often communicate their fear in different ways. But those warnings must be recognized and acted upon. Saman's case also revealed the complicated emotional reality faced by many young people who experience conflict with their families. A person may fear those closest to them while still hoping for reconciliation. A daughter may wish to believe that her parents have changed. A young person may want to repair relationships even after experiencing pressure or threats. These emotions are not contradictions. They are part of the complexity of family relationships. According to the evidence examined in the case, Saman returned home after believing that the situation with her family had improved. That decision became one of the most tragic turning points in the entire story. The investigation that followed demonstrated how difficult it can be to uncover the truth when a crime happens without direct witnesses. There was no single moment that revealed everything. Instead, investigators had to reconstruct events piece by piece. Surveillance footage provided a timeline. Digital messages revealed Saman's concerns before she disappeared. Phone records showed the sudden end of her communication. The movements of family members after her disappearance raised further questions. The discovery of her remains more than 18 months later provided confirmation of the tragedy. and allowed forensic experts to establish that her death was the result of homicide. This process showed the importance of patience and persistence in criminal investigations. Many cases are solved through a confession or an eyewitness account. The case of Saman Abbas was different. Investigators had to rely on a combination of evidence, each piece strengthening the others. A single camera recording could not explain the entire story. A single message could not answer every question. A forensic examination could not reconstruct every detail because of the condition of the remains. But together, the evidence created a picture that prosecutors argued demonstrated a deliberate act carried out because Saman refused to surrender control over her own life. The legal proceedings that followed were therefore not only about punishment. They were also about establishing a public record of what had happened. Courts examined the actions of each accused person individually. They considered the arguments of prosecutors and defense lawyers. They evaluated evidence collected during years of investigation. Through the judicial process, different courts reached conclusions regarding the responsibility of those involved, with the appellate judgment expanding the convictions of several defendants. The continued review by Italy's highest court reflected the seriousness of the case and the importance of ensuring that even the most emotionally powerful cases are judged through legal procedures. Beyond the courtroom, however, Saman's name became part of a larger social conversation. Her death forced Italy to examine issues that are often hidden behind private family walls. Questions emerged about how authorities respond when young people report forced marriage, how communities can recognize warning signs, and how systems of protection can be improved. The case became a reference point in discussions about safeguarding individuals who feel unable to control important decisions about their own lives. The phrase family honor became central to those discussions. Prosecutors argued that Saman was killed because her choices were considered unacceptable by members of her family. The case highlighted the danger that occurs when ideas about reputation, obedience, or tradition are placed above an individual's basic rights and safety. At the same time, the broader conversation required care and responsibility. The actions investigated and judged in this case belonged to specific individuals. They should not be used to define entire communities or cultures. The tragedy of Saman Abbas was a human tragedy caused by alleged acts of violence, not a simple conflict between different societies. One of the strongest lessons from Saman's story is the importance of personal freedom. The choices she fought to make were ordinary choices for many young adults, choosing whom to love, deciding whether to marry, and imagining a future based on personal hopes rather than decisions imposed by others. Yet for Saman, these choices became the center of a conflict that eventually led to her death. That contrast is what made her story resonate so deeply. The things she wanted were not extraordinary. They were fundamental aspects of personal dignity. Remembering Saman Abbas means remembering more than the details of an investigation. It means remembering the person behind the case. Before becoming the subject of headlines, court documents, and public debate, she was a young woman with relationships, dreams, and plans. She had spent much of her life in Italy. She had grown up in a society where she developed her own understanding of independence and adulthood. She wanted to determine the direction of her own future. Those aspirations shaped her decisions, and they also shaped the events that followed. The tragedy of Saman's death leaves behind a responsibility for those who continue to study and discuss her case. That responsibility is to look beyond the shocking details and understand the warning signs. It is to recognize that a request for help may represent a moment of extreme vulnerability. It is to understand that protection requires not only laws and institutions, but also awareness, attention, and the willingness to believe those who say they are afraid. In the end, the legacy of Saman Abbas is not defined only by the circumstances of her death. It is also defined by the courage she showed during the final period of her life. She challenged decisions that she believed were wrong for her. She sought assistance when she felt threatened. She tried to claim the right to determine her own path. Her voice, preserved through the evidence collected after her disappearance, continues to be heard. The investigation may eventually reach its final legal conclusion, but the meaning of Salman's story will continue beyond the courtroom. Her name remains connected to conversations about justice, protection, and human dignity. It reminds society that behind every statistic about forced marriage or family violence is an individual person whose life, hopes, and future matter. Salman Abbas was 18 years old when she disappeared from Navallara. She should have had decades ahead of her to grow, make choices, experience life, and create her own story. Instead, her life became the subject of one of Italy's most significant criminal investigations. The world learned her name because of a tragedy. But the most important way to remember her is not only through what happened to her. It is through the principle that she fought for until the end. That every person deserves the freedom to choose their own life, and that no tradition, expectation, or demand for obedience can justify taking that freedom away. The story of Salman Abbas is a story that began with a young woman searching for the freedom to decide her own future and ended with one of Italy's most closely followed criminal investigations. It is a story shaped by unanswered questions, painful discoveries, years of legal proceedings, and a continuing conversation about protection, justice, and human dignity. But above all, it is the story of a person whose life mattered long before her name appeared in newspapers, court documents, and investigative reports. Salman was not known to the world because of the tragedy that surrounded her. Before the investigation began, before the cameras were reviewed and the courtrooms were filled, she was simply a young woman growing up in Italy. She had dreams of adulthood. She had relationships that were important to her. She had hopes about the kind of life she wanted to build. Like many young people, she wanted the ability to make choices about her own identity, her own relationships, and her own future. The conflict that developed around her was not created in a single moment. It grew over time. According to the evidence examined during the investigation and trials, Salman found herself caught between her own wishes and the expectations imposed upon her by her family. She rejected an arranged marriage. She continued a relationship that she had chosen herself. She sought assistance when she felt she could no longer handle the pressure alone. These decisions were expressions of independence, but they also placed her in a situation that investigators later determined had become extremely dangerous. One of the most haunting aspects of this case is that Salman's fear existed before her disappearance. Her messages to her boyfriend, her decision to contact social services, and her reports about the pressure she experienced all showed that she was attempting to communicate what she was going through. Her words became part of the evidence after she was gone, but they were originally the words of a young woman trying to be heard while she was still alive. The investigation that followed was a long search for truth. Investigators did not have the simple answers that often appear in fictional stories. There was no immediate confession. There was no eyewitness who could describe the entire sequence of events. There was no single piece of evidence that explained everything. Instead, authorities had to rebuild the timeline carefully through surveillance footage, digital communication, phone records, witness statements, and forensic examination. The images recorded by security cameras became some of the most important evidence in the case. They showed Salman's final confirmed movements. They documented the presence of members of her family near the area where she was last seen. They provided investigators with a timeline that became central to the prosecution's reconstruction. Yet those images also represented something more painful. They captured the final moments in which Salman was known to be alive. For more than 18 months, investigators searched for answers. The discovery of human remains near an abandoned farmhouse and the later DNA confirmation that those Remains belonged to Saman brought a tragic conclusion to the search. The forensic examination established that she had died as a result of homicide. Although the condition of the remains prevented experts from determining every detail of what had happened, the evidence could not recreate every second of her final moments. But it confirmed the devastating reality that Saman had not simply disappeared. The courtroom then became the place where that evidence was examined. Prosecutors argued that Saman's death was the result of a planned act connected to her refusal to accept a marriage arranged by her family and her decision to live according to her own choices. Defense lawyers challenged the interpretation of the evidence and questioned whether the available information could establish the responsibility of every accused individual. The courts reviewed these arguments through multiple stages of proceedings, applying the principles of criminal justice. The verdicts that followed represented the legal conclusions reached by the courts. They provided accountability according to the evidence presented and the standards of Italian law. But no sentence could reverse what had happened. Justice could determine responsibility, but it could not return Saman to the life she should have had. That is perhaps the most difficult truth at the center of this case. Behind every investigation is a human life that cannot be restored. Behind every piece of evidence is a person who once had ordinary hopes and ordinary dreams. Saman was not a symbol when she was alive. She became a symbol only afterward, because society searched for meaning in a tragedy that should never have happened. Her name is now connected with discussions about forced marriage, family pressure, and violence committed in the name of so-called honor. Those discussions are important because they encourage societies to examine how vulnerable individuals can be protected. But remembering Saman also requires remembering her as more than the circumstances of her death. She was a young woman who wanted to make her own choices. She wanted to decide whom she loved. She wanted to determine the direction of her own future. These desires were not unusual. They were the basic wishes of someone seeking control over her own life. The legacy of this case is therefore not only found in court decisions or criminal records. It exists in the questions it continues to raise. How can warnings be recognized earlier? How can people who feel threatened by those closest to them find effective protection? How can communities support individuals who are trying to escape situations where their freedom is restricted? These questions remain important because the circumstances surrounding Saman's death are not only about the past, they are about the responsibility of the present and the future. Every time a person reaches out for help, every time someone expresses fear, and every time someone says that they are being forced into a decision that should belong to them, those words carry meaning. The story of Saman Abbas reminds us that justice begins long before a courtroom. It begins when someone listens. It begins when someone believes. It begins when a person at risk is given the protection and support needed to survive. Saman's final days were marked by fear and uncertainty. But her life should not be remembered only through those final days. She should be remembered as a person who had the courage to resist a future she did not choose. She should be remembered as someone who believed her own voice mattered. This case will remain part of Italy's legal and social history because it forced difficult conversations about freedom, family, and protection. But beyond all debates and all proceedings, one message remains clear. Every individual deserves the right to live without fear, to make decisions about their own future, and to be protected when they ask for help. The story of Saman Abbas ends here, but the responsibility created by her story continues. It continues in the work of investigators seeking truth, in courts seeking justice, and in societies seeking ways to prevent another tragedy like this from happening again. Because behind every case file is a person. Behind every headline is a life. And behind the name Saman Abbas was a young woman who wanted nothing more and nothing less than the freedom to choose her own path.